The first time Owen Mercer saw Lucy Doyle, she was swinging an axe at a pine log twice the width of her shoulders, and the axe was winning. It was the tail end of May in the year 1874, and the mountains above Durango, Colorado, were still shaking off the last cold breath of winter. The spruce trees dripped with snowmelt, and the high meadow grass came up bright green and clean, the kind of green that almost hurt to look at after months of gray and white. Owen had lived alone on his ridge for going on 6 years by that point, trapping beaver along the Animas River, hunting elk when the season called for it, keeping mostly to himself in a way that the people of Durango proper had long since stopped questioning. He was the kind of man the town saw once a month when he came down for supplies, the kind of man women whispered about and men watched with cautious respect. He stood 6'3" in his worn leather boots, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorframe and forearms roped with muscle from years of hauling traps, and splitting his own wood, and doing every single thing on his land with nothing but his own 2 hands. His hair was dark brown and hung past the collar of his flannel shirt, and his beard was kept trimmed but full, and his eyes were the color of pine bark in the rain, a deep and steady brown that missed very little. He had noticed the old Callaway property the morning he came back from a 3-day scout along the upper river, because smoke was rising from the chimney of the cabin that had sat empty since old Harold Callaway had died 2 winters prior. That alone was enough to make Owen slow his horse and look. But then he had seen her, a small woman in a brown wool dress with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her dark hair pinned up haphazardly, both hands wrapped around the handle of a felling axe that was clearly built for someone a good deal larger than she was. She brought it down hard, and it glanced off the side of the log and buried itself in the dirt beside her boot, and she stood there for a moment with her hands on her hips and her chin lifted, staring at that log like it had personally insulted her, and then she pulled the axe free and tried again. Owen had watched for a long moment from the tree line. Then he had clicked his horse forward and ridden on toward his own cabin a 1/4 mile up the ridge, because whatever that woman was doing down there was not his business, and he had learned long ago that people in these mountains generally did not welcome interference. He had not, however, stopped watching. The Callaway property sat in a lower meadow just visible from the eastern window of Owen's cabin, and through the weeks that followed, he found himself looking down at it with increasing frequency. Her name came to him by way of Miller's General Store when he rode into Durango on his monthly supply run in the first week of June. Tom Miller was a man who knew everything worth knowing about everyone in a 50-mile radius, and he did not need much prompting to share it. That young widow woman took the Callaway place, Tom said, stacking Owen's flour and dried beans on the counter with the practiced ease of a man who had filled this exact order 100 times. Name's Lucy Doyle. Came out from Missouri, I'm told, after her husband passed this past winter. Diphtheria took him something terrible. She's got some savings, and she paid Harold's cousin fair and square for the deed. 24 years old, and she intends to run cattle. Tom paused with the weight of someone who has saved the most interesting detail for last. On her own. Owen paid for his supplies and loaded his horse and said nothing about Lucy Doyle all the way back up the mountain, but her name settled somewhere in the back of his mind and stayed there. June came in hot and dry for the high country, which was unusual. The snowmelt had come fast, and the ground was already firming up in ways that made water scarce, and Owen could see from his ridge that Lucy Doyle was having a hard time of it. She had acquired 3 cattle, 2 horses, a small flock of chickens, and what appeared to be 1 very stubborn milk goat, all before she had adequately repaired the fencing around the Callaway pasture. Owen watched through the weeks as she chased those cattle back from the tree line 3, 4, 5 times a day, a small determined figure in a sunbonnet, moving at a near run across the meadow grass with her skirts hiked up and her voice carrying faintly up to his ridge on the warm mountain air. He watched her wrestle with fence posts that were too heavy for her. He watched her haul water from the creek in 2 buckets on a shoulder yoke that made her stagger sideways when the ground was uneven. He watched her rebuild the southeast corner of the cabin roof. With materials she had hauled herself from town in a wagon, she was still figuring out how to load properly. And he watched her do it with a determination that was frankly remarkable even when she was clearly doing it wrong. He told himself it was not his concern. July was hotter still, one of those dry Colorado summers that turned the meadow grass gold weeks before it should, and Lucy Doyle pushed forward with the grim and tireless energy of a woman who had decided she was going to succeed at this or die trying. Owen started noticing things he did not want to notice. The way she moved in the early morning when the air was still cool, quick and efficient and quietly purposeful. The way she talked to her animals, a low and even murmur he could not hear the words of but could tell from its rhythm, was equal parts instruction and encouragement. The way she sat on the cabin steps in the evenings with her hair down and loose around her shoulders, looking out at the mountains with an expression he could not fully read from this distance, but which he recognized in some wordless way as belonging to a person who was carrying a great deal more than they let show. He had been that person once. He remembered it well. Owen Mercer had come to these mountains in 1868 at the age of 26, following a war that had taken his 2 brothers and his father, and then a year of trying to fit himself back into a world that felt 2 sizes too small for whatever he had become. He had found the ridge by accident and claimed it by persistence, and the solitude had been, at first, medicine, and then habit, and then simply the shape of his life. He was not unhappy. He was steady and capable, and the mountains asked nothing of him that he could not give. But watching Lucy Doyle down in that meadow, watching her fight the land and the summer and the 1,000 ordinary difficulties of a life being built from scratch, Owen felt something shifting in him that he had not felt in a very long time. He did not act on it. Not in June, not in July, not in the first 3 weeks of August, and he told himself firmly and repeatedly that this was wisdom rather than cowardice. Then August brought a problem that changed the calculus entirely. He saw it from his ridge on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of clear hot day where the sky was so deeply blue it looked painted. Lucy's chickens were in the yard, and she was hanging washing on the line she had strung between 2 posts, and Owen had his field glasses out of habit rather than intention when he saw the shape moving in the tree line at the edge of her property. A mountain lion, a big one from the look of it, tawny and heavy-shouldered, crouched in the shadows of the spruce trees and absolutely fixed on those chickens. Owen was down the ridge and across the lower meadow in 15 minutes, moving fast on foot with his rifle in hand, and he came through the fence gate at a near run just as Lucy stepped off her back porch and saw the lion herself. She had a shotgun in her hands which surprised him, and she raised it without hesitation, but the lion was out of useful range for a shotgun, and she clearly knew it because she held her shot. Owen raised his Winchester, sighted and fired once. The lion broke from the tree line and ran, unhit but thoroughly persuaded, crashing back into the spruce forest with a speed that made clear it had no intention of returning today. There was a long silence. Lucy Doyle lowered her shotgun and turned to look at him, and this was the first time Owen saw her face clearly and up close, and it did something to him that he was not at all prepared for. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way that was considered fashionable back east, not fine-boned and porcelain, nothing like that. She was something better. She had a strong jaw and dark eyes the color of good coffee and a wide, expressive mouth that was currently pressed into a firm line as she looked at him. And there was a streak of wood ash on her left cheekbone, and her hair was coming loose from its pins. And she was holding that shotgun with the easy confidence of a woman who knew how to use it. And Owen Mercer, who had been alone for 6 years, and had thought himself entirely settled in that solitude, felt the ground move slightly beneath him. "That was my shot to take," she said, which was the first thing she ever said to him, and her voice was even and low and carried a Missouri flatness that was not unpleasant. You were out of range, he said. I know that. I was waiting for it to come closer. She looked at the tree line where the lion had disappeared, then back at him. It might have. It might not have. Your chickens were its target, and lions move fast when they decide to move. She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed quite thoroughly. You live up on that ridge, she said. It was not a question. I do, he said. I have seen your smoke up there. Most mornings. Another pause. You have been watching this property. It was a statement of fact rather than an accusation, but it was direct enough that Owen felt the back of his neck warm. I keep an eye on the valley in general, he said, which was true but was not all of the truth, and something in her expression told him she recognized the partial nature of his answer. Well, she said at length, I suppose I am glad you were watching today, whatever the reason. She looked down at the shotgun in her hands and then back up at him. I am Lucy Doyle. I know, he said, and then realized how that sounded. Tom Miller told me your name when I was in town for supplies in June. Owen Mercer, she said, which startled him. You know me? Tom Miller told me about you as well, she said, and for the first time there was the brief ghost of something that might have been a smile at the corner of her mouth. He seems to be the general repository of information for this part of Colorado. He is, Owen agreed. The ghost of the smile came and went. Well, Mr. Mercer, thank you for the lion. I have been meaning to come up the ridge and introduce myself since I arrived, but there has been a great deal to do. There is always a great deal to do on a homestead, he said. Yes, she said, and the word carried in it something that was not a complaint exactly, but was honest in a way that acknowledged the weight of things. Would you like some coffee? It is the least I can offer. He should have said no. He knew it even as he said yes. She had the inside of the cabin tidy and spare, a woman who had learned to create order in small spaces, and the coffee she set before him at the rough-hewn table was strong and good. Owen sat with his hat on the table and his hands wrapped around the tin mug and looked around the cabin and saw the evidence of her summer's work everywhere: repaired boards, new clay chinking between the logs, a window reframed and reglazed, shelves built and loaded with careful provisions. It was the home of someone who worked hard and thought ahead and wasted nothing. You have done a great deal of work here, he said. More left to do, she said, sitting across from him with her own mug. The north pasture fence is still not right. I have been fighting with the posts all week. She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but he heard the fatigue underneath it. The ground is harder than I expected. I do not have the tools to drive them properly. A post driver would help, he said. There is one in my tool shed I am not using currently. She looked at him across the table with an expression that was not quite pride and not quite suspicion, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both. I do not take charity, she said, in a tone that indicated this was not a recent decision but a long-held and deeply settled principle. It is not charity, he said. It is a neighbor lending a tool. That is a different thing altogether in these mountains. People up here depend on that kind of exchange or they do not survive. She considered this with the seriousness of someone who weighed things carefully before accepting them. I would need to return it promptly, she said. Keep it as long as you need it, he said. I know where to find it. The smile came back, and this time it stayed a little longer, and Owen felt it like a brief warm pressure somewhere in the center of his chest. He brought the post driver down the next morning and showed her how to use it properly, demonstrated twice on the first stubborn post until it was seated solid and square, and then handed it over and watched her drive the second one herself with a focus and a precision that told him she had spent the intervening evening thinking through exactly what he had shown her. She did not ask him to stay, and he did not volunteer to. But when he turned to go back up the ridge, she called after him. Mr. Mercer, he turned. The fence along the south pasture is also a problem, she said, and her chin was lifted and her voice was perfectly steady, and he understood that this was her way of asking without precisely asking. I will take a look at it tomorrow, he said. He took a look at it tomorrow, and the day after that he repaired a section of the corral that was letting her horses drift. And by the end of the following week, he had fallen into a pattern of coming down the ridge in the mornings to help with whatever needed 2 pairs of hands, which on a homestead being run by one person was, it turned out, a great many things. He told himself he was being a good neighbor. He told himself this was what people did out here, helped each other. It was the code of the mountains and the frontier, and there was nothing unusual about it. He told himself this right up until the morning he spent 2 hours repairing her chicken coop, and then looked up to find her watching him work with an expression that was soft and unguarded in a way she usually kept carefully tucked away. And something moved between them in that moment that was not about chicken coops at all, and they both felt it and both pretended they had not. September came in on a cool breath that hinted at the winter still 3 months away, but reminded everyone in the mountains to take stock and prepare. Owen started bringing extra things when he came down: a haunch of elk he had taken up on the ridge, dried berries he had collected along the river trail, extra lamp oil he could spare. He told himself these were practical contributions to a neighbor who was still finding her feet. Lucy accepted each thing with the same considered grace, never effusive, always genuine, always finding a way to give something back. A jar of the preserves she had put up from the wild plums along the creek. A length of mending done on a shirt he had mentioned was past repair. Once a loaf of bread that was the best thing he had eaten in longer than he could honestly remember. "Where did you learn to bake like this?" he asked, sitting at her table with a second slice. "My mother," she said, and something shifted in her face, a brief shadow. "She died when I was 17, but I had had 10 years of her teaching by then." "She taught you well," he said. "She taught me everything worth knowing," Lucy said quietly, and then she looked up at him and the shadow passed and she said with a directness that was characteristic of her, "What about you? Who taught you to live up on a ridge by yourself and fix everything within a 5-mile radius?" He laughed at that, a short and genuine sound that surprised him because he had gone years without laughing easily, and he said, "My father, he was a practical man. He believed a man who could not take care of his own business was a burden on everyone around him." "He sounds like he was hard," she said carefully. "He was not unkind," Owen said after a moment, "but he was formed by hard times. The frontier does that to people." "Yes," she said, and there it was again, that layer beneath the word, that weight she carried. "What happened to him?" "The war," Owen said simply, and she did not press, because out here in 1874 you did not press people on the war. The wound was still too raw in too many people for questions to be comfortable. "I am sorry," she said. "I am sorry about your husband," he said, and meant it. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers around her mug, looking at the table. "James was a good man," she said at last. "He was kind. He believed in this plan, the land out west, the cattle, the fresh start. It was his dream as much as mine. When he died I thought about going home." She paused. "But there is nothing left in Missouri for me. My family is gone, my mother when I was young, my father 3 years after, no brothers or sisters. James was my family." She looked up and her eyes were steady even if they held a depth of feeling that was not small. "And his dream felt like the last piece of him I could hold on to, so I came anyway." Owen looked at her across the table and felt something open up in his chest, a wide and aching tenderness that he did not have words for and did not try to find them. He said, "You are doing it well." "I am doing it stubbornly," she said, and the ghost smile came back. "Whether that is the same as well remains to be seen." He thought about that on the walk back up the ridge in the early autumn dusk, about the difference between stubbornness and strength, and he decided that in Lucy Doyle's case, they were not different things at all but the same thing seen from 2 different angles. The first frost came in the 3rd week of September, earlier than usual, and Owen spent the better part of 2 days helping Lucy put the garden to bed and stack the last of the firewood against the cabin wall. They worked side by side through the long, cool afternoon, him splitting and her stacking, finding a rhythm together that felt easy and natural and older than it had any right to feel given that they had known each other barely a month. The air smelled of pine and turned leaves and the clean cold that came down from the peaks, and Lucy's cheeks were flushed with the chill and the work. And somewhere in the middle of the third cord of wood, Owen realized he was watching her more than he was watching the wood, and made a pointed effort to correct this. It was on the last day of September that something shifted, explicitly and without possibility of pretending otherwise. Lucy had come up the ridge that morning for the first time, which surprised him because she had never before come to his cabin, always waiting for him to come to her. And he saw her from the window crossing his upper meadow with her dark green wool jacket buttoned to the throat and her hair braided over one shoulder, and a look on her face that was purposeful in the particular way that meant she had made up her mind about something. He opened the door before she reached it. "There is something wrong with the milk goat," she said. "She is not right. I do not know what is wrong with her, but she is not eating and she is lying down too much." Owen pulled on his boots and jacket and came. He knew goats reasonably well, had kept a few himself in his early years on the ridge, and when he crouched beside the animal in her small pen and ran his hands along her sides, he found the problem quickly. A blockage, not uncommon, treatable if you knew what you were doing. He worked quietly while Lucy stood beside him in the small pen, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, and after 20 minutes the goat was standing and eating and looking considerably more herself. Lucy let out a slow breath that she had clearly been holding for a while. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. "It is nothing serious," he said, standing and washing his hands at the pump. "She should be fine." "Thank you," Lucy said again, and when he turned she was looking at him with an expression that was unguarded in a way he had not seen from her before, something raw and genuine and grateful that went deeper than the goat. "Owen," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and he felt it like a struck match. "I do not know what I would have done this summer without you." "You would have managed," he said, because he believed it, because she was the kind of woman who found a way. "Eventually," she said, "perhaps. But you made things possible that I think would have broken me otherwise." She looked at him steadily, the way she looked at everything, directly and honestly and without flinching. "I want you to know that I see what you have done, and I am grateful for it, genuinely." The afternoon light was golden and slanted through the pin spruce, and the mountains were purple in the distance, and Lucy Doyle was looking at him with dark eyes full of honesty and warmth. And Owen Mercer had spent 6 years being careful and certain of his solitude, and all of that careful certainty turned out to be considerably less solid than he had believed. He said, "I did not do it only to be neighborly, Lucy." She went very still. "I did it because I wanted to," he said, "because I could not watch you struggle down there and not be part of the solution, because somewhere in the middle of all that fence mending and wood splitting I stopped being your neighbor and started being something I do not entirely have a word for yet." He paused, aware that he was saying more at once than he had said in most of the past year combined, but finding that once started he could not reasonably stop. "I do not know what you want or what you are ready for, and I understand if the answer is that you want a neighbor and nothing more. But I would not be honest with you if I pretended I have not been watching you all summer for reasons that have nothing to do with mountain lions." The silence stretched between them, and the wind moved through the spruce trees, and somewhere far up the mountain a hawk cried once and went quiet. Then Lucy said, "I have been watching you too." It was said simply and flatly in her Missouri way, with no drama or performance, just the plain truth of it offered with both hands, and Owen felt his chest do something complicated and warm. "I was not certain what to do about it," she said. "I did not expect to feel anything for anyone, not this soon. It has not even been a year since James." She said it with honesty rather than guilt, and then she said, "But James was a man who believed in life. He would not want me to spend mine being afraid of feeling things." Owen took one step forward. Then he stopped and waited, because he was a man who had learned the hard way that patience was the most important tool in any difficult undertaking. Lucy took the step that closed the distance between them. He did not kiss her that day. He took her hand, which was calloused and capable and fit inside his the way something fits when it was always supposed to fit there. And they stood in the late September afternoon with the mountains around them and the first yellow leaves coming off the aspens, and it was enough. More than enough. It was the kind of beginning that did not need to be rushed because it had the feeling of something that was going to take its time and be all the better for it. He walked her back down the ridge in the early evening, and they talked, really talked. The kind of talking that happens when two people who have been careful for a long time finally let their guard drop a little. She told him about Missouri, about growing up the youngest in a family that had slowly whittled away until there was only her, about meeting James Doyle at a church social when she was 19 and marrying him at 20, and believing fully and without reservation in their future together. She told him about the winter James got sick, how fast diphtheria moved, how she had sat with him through the nights and held his hand and talked to him about Colorado and the cattle and the life they would build, and how in the end he had gone quietly, and she had been grateful for the quiet even through the grief. Owen told her about the war in broad strokes, not the specifics because those were still things that lived in a place he did not open often, but enough. He told her about his brothers, both older, both gone at Chickamauga within a day of each other, in a coincidence so brutal it had taken him years to look at it clearly. He told her about his father going the year after, not in battle but worn down by grief in a way that amounted to the same thing, and about coming west because east held nothing but the shape of everything he had lost. "And you have been alone up on that ridge ever since," she said. "I have," he said. "Did you mean to stay alone?" He considered the question honestly. "I meant to for a while," he said. "And then a while became a habit and a habit became a life and I stopped asking myself the question." "Until this summer," she said. "Until this summer," he agreed. She left him at her gate with the evening star just appearing above the peaks, and she looked back once from the cabin door and he was still standing at the gate, and something passed between them across that distance, a look that was its own kind of promise. October in the high country was spectacularly beautiful and extremely busy, and Owen spent a good portion of it at the Callaway place with Lucy, because there was simply no argument to be made for not doing so. They winterized the cabin together, patched the roof properly, banked the foundation, stacked firewood until the pile against the north wall was 6 feet high. Owen taught Lucy to set a snare for rabbits, which she took to with characteristic focus and efficiency, and she taught him, in return, how to make the preserving brine she used for the wild plums, which he had been doing wrong for years without knowing it. They moved around each other in a rhythm that felt settled and easy in a way that was remarkable for two people who had known each other barely 2 months, and the ease of it was not the ease of familiarity but something deeper, the ease of fundamental compatibility, of two people whose essential natures fit together without chafing. He kissed her for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of October. They had been hanging the last of the dried herbs from the rafters of her cabin, and he had been handing bundles up to her where she stood on a chair to reach the high hooks, and she had turned to take a bundle from him and was closer than expected, and their eyes met and stayed met. And then Owen Mercer, who had been patient and careful and deliberate his entire adult life, decided he had been patient long enough. He cupped her face in both his large hands, carefully, as if she were something precious that deserved handling with the best care he had to offer, and he kissed her. She kissed him back immediately and without hesitation, which was the most Lucy Doyle thing she could possibly have done, and the kiss tasted like autumn and pine smoke and the particular sweetness of something begun at exactly the right moment. When they broke apart, she was still standing on the chair so their eyes were level, and she looked at him with flushed cheeks and steady eyes and said, "I thought you were never going to do that." "I was trying to be patient," he said. "Owen," she said with great seriousness, "you have been patient for an entire summer. I think you have earned the right to stop." He laughed, a full real laugh, and she laughed too, and the sound of it together in that small warm cabin with the dried herbs swaying in the rafters and the mountains going golden outside the window was, Owen thought, the finest thing he had heard in a very long time. They took it slowly nonetheless, because both of them were people who had learned through loss to hold precious things with care rather than grip. He came down the ridge every day now without pretending there was only a practical reason for it. They worked together in the mornings, and in the afternoons they talked, and sometimes in the evenings he stayed for supper and they sat by her fire with coffee, and she would read aloud from the small collection of books she had brought from Missouri, her voice even and musical in the firelight. And Owen would sit back in the chair he had come to think of as his and watch the fire and listen and feel, for the first time in a very long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He made his monthly supply run to Durango in the third week of October, and Tom Miller took one look at him and said, "Well, something has changed." "I am buying supplies," Owen said. "You are buying supplies and smiling," Tom said, enormously pleased with himself. "You have not smiled in this store in 6 years, Owen Mercer. You have been a perfectly pleasant man and a reliable customer and about as warm as January in the high country." "I am plenty warm," Owen said. "You have been down to the Calloway place," Tom said, which was not a question because Tom Miller never wasted questions on things he already knew. "She is a neighbor," Owen said. "She is a fine woman," Tom said, and his voice had shifted from gossip to something genuine and kind. "She has had a rough road. She deserves something good." Owen looked at Tom for a moment and then said, with a straightforwardness that surprised even himself, "I intend to give her something good if she will have it." Tom Miller grinned the grin of a man who would be telling this story for years. "Well then," he said, "you had better add a tin of good tea to that order. I happen to know she has a preference for it." Owen added the tea. He did not examine too closely how Tom Miller knew Lucy's tea preference, because Tom Miller knew everything, and it was easier to simply accept this as a fact of life in Durango County. He brought the tea down the ridge that afternoon and set it on her table without explanation, and she picked it up and looked at the label, and then looked at him with an expression that was warm and amused and something else underneath that he was only just learning to read. "You went to town," she said. "Monthly supply run," he said. "And you thought of me," she said. "I think of you considerably more than monthly," he said, which was more honest than he had intended but entirely true. She set the tin down and crossed to him and put her hand against his jaw, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood like that for a long moment in the afternoon light, and Owen felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for 6 long years. November came with a cold that was serious rather than preparatory, the kind of deep mountain cold that settled in for the duration and meant business. The first real snow of the season fell on the 5th of November, 6 inches overnight and more coming by the look of the sky. Owen came down the ridge in the morning with extra lamp oil and a quarter of elk he had been keeping in the cold of his root cellar, and found Lucy already up and about, and entirely untroubled by the snow, moving around her cabin and outbuildings with the brisk competence that he had come to recognize as her default mode in any situation that called for action. "I thought you might need," he started. "I am fine," she said, from the top of the chicken coop ladder where she was reinforcing the door latch against the weather. "But I would not say no to help with the horses. The water trough froze overnight, and I cannot break it adequately with the handle I have." He broke the ice in the trough with the back of his axe while she finished with the chickens, and then they brought the cattle in close to the barn, and made sure the hay supply was accessible, and the goat was settled. And by noon, everything was secured, and Lucy was making a soup on her stove that smelled like heaven itself had taken up residence in a cast iron pot. "Stay for the noon meal," she said, not quite asking, not quite telling, in the way she did things when she wanted something and was still getting used to the wanting. He stayed for the noon meal, and he stayed through the afternoon while the snow came down soft and thick beyond the windows, and he stayed for supper. And when the evening was late and the fire had burned down to coals, and Lucy had fallen asleep in the chair across from him with her head tipped to one side and her book open in her lap, he put an extra log on the fire and draped his coat over her, and let himself out quietly into the winter night, and walked back up his ridge in the snow with a fullness in his heart that he had no word for in any language he knew. He came back early the next morning, before she was fully awake, and had her water heated and her animals fed before she came out in her coat and boots and found him at the pump. She stopped in the cabin doorway and looked at him for a moment with sleep still in her eyes and her hair loose over her shoulders, and she said, "Owen Mercer, you are making it very difficult for me to maintain any kind of self-sufficiency." "Good," he said. She laughed, and the laugh was bright in the cold winter morning, and she said, "Come inside. The coffee is almost ready." December moved differently from the months before it, slower and more interior, the way winter in the mountains always moved. The snow settled in properly, and the days shortened, and the peaks above them were white all the way down, and the world got quiet and small in the way that the frontier winter made it. The world narrowed to what was close and warm and yours. Owen spent more time at Lucy's cabin than at his own without making a formal declaration about it, and Lucy accepted this without making a formal declaration about it either, which was its own kind of declaration from two people who communicated as much in what they did not say as in what they did. He told her about his brothers one night by her fire, the real story, the details he did not share, and found that telling her was not what he had expected. He had expected it to be like opening an old wound, which was what talking about it had always felt like before. Instead, it was more like showing someone a scar and having them look at it honestly and say, "I see this, I see what it cost you," and still being there afterwards. Lucy listened without interrupting and without flinching, and when he finished she said, "They would be glad you found your way here." And it was such a simple and direct and entirely right thing to say that he felt it move through him like warmth moves through cold hands held near a fire. "They would have liked you," he said, which surprised him even as he said it because he had not known he was going to say it. "I hope so," she said quietly. On Christmas Eve, Owen came down the ridge with a package that he had been working on in his cabin workshop for 3 weeks, a small writing desk built from a piece of cherry wood he had been saving for years without knowing what it was saved for. He had made it with the kind of care he had not given to any object in a long time, dovetailed corners and a fitted lid, and a small brass catch that he had traded a beaver pelt for in town, because it was exactly right and nothing else would do. Lucy had mentioned once that she wanted to write down the account of her first year here, everything she had learned, everything that had happened and he had remembered. She opened it on Christmas morning, because she made him wait until Christmas morning, and when she lifted the lid and ran her fingers along the smooth interior and looked at the brass catch and looked up at him, her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears but was something adjacent to them. "Owen," she said. "I did not know what else to get you," he said, which was only halfway true. He had known exactly what to get her, and it had taken him 3 weeks of careful work to get it right. She stood up from the table and crossed to him and stood on her toes and kissed him, and he wrapped his arms around her and held her with a careful and immense tenderness. And outside the snow fell soft and steady on the mountains, and the world was quiet and white and complete. They had Christmas dinner together, a proper meal, the elk roast and the dried apple pie she had been planning for a week, and the good coffee and the tin of tea from Tom Miller's. And they sat at her table in the warm glow of the lantern and talked through the afternoon and into the evening. And Owen thought that this was the best Christmas he had spent in longer than he could clearly remember, maybe the best of his life. The new year, 1875, came in cold and clear, and with it came something Owen had been working up to for 2 months. He had thought about how to say it every way there was to say it, had rehearsed words in his head on the walks up and down the ridge, and lying awake in his cabin at night. And in the end, he decided that the right way to say it to Lucy Doyle was the direct way, because she was a direct woman and she would not appreciate being talked around. It was the 5th of January, a Sunday, and they had been to the Christmas service in Durango together the week prior, which had been, in the particular economy of small frontier towns, essentially a public announcement of their attachment. Tom Miller had been visibly delighted. The minister had shaken Owen's hand with a warmth that suggested he had been hoping for this. Lucy had walked through it all with her chin up and her eyes steady and her hand in the crook of Owen's arm, and he had never in his life been prouder to stand beside anyone. Now it was Sunday, and they were sitting at her table with the late afternoon light coming cold and clear through the windows, and Owen put down his coffee mug and said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him with attention that was complete, the way she gave her attention to everything that mattered. "I know you have your land and your cattle and your independence," he said, "and I know those things matter to you, and I do not want you to think for one moment that I want you to give them up or set them aside. They are part of who you are, and they are part of what I love about you." He paused, and the word love had come out more easily than he had expected, easier than he had said any word in recent memory, which told him something about whether it was true. "What I want to ask is whether you would consider combining them with mine, whether you would consider marrying me, Lucy." She was quiet for a moment that was neither short nor long, but was absolutely, perfectly still. Then she said, "Owen Mercer, I thought you were never going to ask." "You said that about the kiss," he said. "I meant it about both," she said, and she was smiling now, the full open smile that she did not give easily but gave completely when she gave it, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is an absolutely yes," she said. He came around the table and she stood to meet him, and he held her with both arms around her and his face in her hair, and she held him back just as hard. And outside the January mountains were still and cold and magnificent, and inside the cabin was the warmth of something built carefully and honestly and meant to last. They were married in the second week of March, 1875, when the mountains were still winter cold, but the first suggestion of spring was in the tilt of the light. The ceremony was performed by the minister in Durango, a simple and direct service in the little church that smelled of pine boards and candle wax, with Tom Miller and his wife in the front row looking as though they had personally arranged the match, which Tom probably believed, and 3 or 4 other families from the outlying homesteads who had come to know Lucy over the course of the summer and wanted to see her well situated. Lucy wore her good dress, a deep blue wool that Owen had never seen her in before and which did something remarkable to her dark eyes, and she had her hair pinned up with the small pearl combs that had been her mother's. And when she walked into the church on Tom Miller's arm, because there was no one else to give her away, and Tom had offered with such genuine feeling that she had accepted, Owen was waiting at the front, and when he saw her his throat went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked at him and smiled the full open smile, and he felt himself smile back, and the minister said something that Owen did not entirely hear because he was too busy looking at the woman walking toward him. The vows they said were the traditional ones, but when they said them with the particular weight of people who had known loss, and knew therefore exactly what they were promising, and understood precisely what it was worth. Owen slid a ring onto Lucy's finger that he had ordered from the jeweler in Durango, and paid for with the best of his winter trapping, a simple gold band that was not elaborate but was exactly right, and Lucy's hand was steady and warm in his, and her dark eyes never left his face. They had a wedding supper at the hotel in Durango, a small celebration with their few friends, and Tom Miller gave a toast that was long on sentiment and short on brevity, and made his wife elbow him twice, and Lucy laughed, and Owen laughed, and the evening was warm with the kind of happiness that comes from things being genuinely right rather than simply fortunate. They rode home to the mountain in the early evening, Lucy on her horse and Owen on his, side by side on the trail back up through the pines, and the last of the daylight was on the peaks above them, pink and gold on the snowfields, and the sky behind the mountains was that deep mountain violet that you only saw at altitude as the day gave way to dark. "Whose cabin?" Lucy asked. "Yours," he said. "Mine is smaller and yours has the better stove." "My stove is not better than yours," she said. "My stove has been temperamental since November," he admitted. "I have been meaning to fix the flue damper." She gave him a look that was simultaneously fond and exasperated. "Owen." "It has been 4 months. I have been busy," he said, and glanced at her sideways with a half-smile. "I found something that occupied my attention considerably more than the flue damper." She shook her head, but she was smiling, and the smile was the full one, and Owen thought he could ride beside this woman for the rest of his life and find every mile of it worthwhile. They settled into the Calloway place, which they started calling simply the Mercer place, and the combination of two capable people working the same land produced results that neither of them had managed alone. Owen's skill with animals and terrain supplemented Lucy's sharp organizational mind and her meticulous approach to planning and provision, and together they expanded the cattle operation carefully, adding 4 head in the spring and building a proper barn through April and May to house them. Owen's trapping income through the winter had given them a solid base to work from, and Lucy's careful management of the homestead through the summer and fall had already produced enough preserved food and basic provision to last through another hard winter without strain. Owen rebuilt his own cabin not as a residence but as a workshop and a place to store his trapping equipment and the larger tools, and the ridge trail between the two properties became so well-traveled it wore itself smooth by summer. April brought something neither of them had yet quite said out loud, but both of them were thinking about. Lucy told him on a morning in late April, setting down her coffee mug and looking at him across the breakfast table with the particular directness that meant she had something significant to say. "I think we may be expecting," she said. Owen looked at her across the table. "You think?" "I am fairly certain," she said, in the tone of a woman who had been carrying this knowledge for at least 2 weeks and had examined it from every angle before deciding it was worth saying out loud. He stood up from the table and came around and lifted her out of her chair and held her carefully, as though she had become something even more precious than she already was, which he had not believed possible. She laughed against his shoulder and said, "I am not made of glass, Owen," and he said, "I know that. I know that better than anyone," but he held her no less carefully. He spent the next 3 days quietly rebuilding the small back room of the cabin into a proper nursery, adding insulation between the logs, and building a cradle from a piece of the same cherry wood he had used for her writing desk. And Lucy came to the doorway on the 3rd afternoon and found him fitting the rails of the cradle together. And she stood there with her hand on the doorframe and watched him work with an expression that was so full of love it was almost difficult to look at directly. "It is going to be beautiful," she said. "The baby or the cradle," he said. "Both," she said. "Though you should know I do not care which it is, boy or girl." "I do not either," he said honestly. "I care only that both of you are well." "We will be well," she said, with the settled certainty of a woman who had decided this was the outcome and was not entertaining alternatives. Summer came again to the mountains, the second summer that Owen had watched over that meadow, but everything about it was different from the first. Lucy was still capable and still determined and still the woman who did not stop until the work was done, but she was not alone now, and the difference that made was not simply the practical help, though that was considerable. The difference was visible in small things. The way she moved through her days with something lighter in her step. The way she laughed more and worried less. The way she sat on the cabin steps in the evenings now with Owen beside her rather than alone, his arm around her, both of them watching the mountains go from gold to purple to dark while the summer insects sang in the meadow grass. Owen found himself watching her still, but for different reasons now. He watched her because she was his and he was hers, and he could not conceive of a better thing to look at in the whole wide world. Their son was born on the 14th of October, 1875, on a clear cold morning that turned the aspens to pure gold, and he was healthy and loud and indignant about being born, which Owen considered a good sign in a person. They named him Thomas James Mercer, Thomas for Tom Miller, who had become as close to family as either of them had in this part of the world, and James for Lucy's first husband, because Lucy had said quietly that James had dreamed of this land and this life, and it seemed right to carry his name forward into it, and Owen had agreed without hesitation because it was exactly right. Tom Miller, when he heard about the name, turned red in the face and had to blow his nose with great theatrics while his wife patted his arm and pretended not to notice. Thomas James Mercer was from his first days a large and loud and thoroughly determined person, and Owen watched him grow through the winter and into the spring with a wonder that he had not known was possible, the specific wonder of watching a person who is entirely new to the world discover each ordinary thing for the first time. He discovered his own hands. He discovered the goat. He discovered the sound of the wind in the spruce trees and found it deeply interesting. He discovered his father's beard, which he investigated with both fists and considerable thoroughness, and Owen bore this with the patience of a man who had decided there was no inconvenience too great that this small person could impose. Lucy nursed Thomas through the winter and looked at Owen over the baby's head with eyes that were soft and bright and entirely happy, and Owen met her eyes every time and felt the same. Spring of 1876 brought warmer days and the particular business of a cattle operation entering its second proper year. They had built the herd to 14 head over the winter with the addition of a bull, a substantial investment that required careful management, and Owen and Lucy worked it together, splitting the physical work in ways that accounted for Lucy still regaining her full strength after Thomas and Owen covering the gaps without comment, because it was simply what needed doing. Lucy was not a woman who liked to be coddled, and Owen had learned early not to attempt it. But there was a difference between coddling and simply being attentive to what a person needed, and he had become very good at the latter. Tom Miller came up the mountain in May for the first time ever, which was notable enough that Owen and Lucy both came out to meet him on the trail with some alarm, because Tom Miller was not a man who left Durango if he could help it. He came bearing a letter that had arrived at the store for Lucy from a lawyer in Kansas City, which Tom had decided required personal delivery because he wanted to know what was in it, a motive he did not bother to conceal. The letter was from the estate of a distant cousin of Lucy's father, who had died intestate and whose property, in the absence of closer heirs, had reverted through careful legal work to Lucy as the only traceable blood relation remaining. The property was not large, a town lot in Kansas City worth perhaps $300, but the money was real and unexpected and would add considerably to their capacity to expand the cattle operation. Lucy read the letter twice and handed it to Owen and said, "Well, well," he agreed. "That is a good thing," Tom Miller said hopefully, looking between them. "Tom," Lucy said, "you rode 12 miles up a mountain to read someone else's mail." "I rode 12 miles up a mountain to deliver important correspondence in a timely fashion," Tom said, with dignity. "Stay for supper," Owen said, because there was no point arguing with Tom Miller about his own motivations, and because the man had ridden 12 miles and was looking hopefully at the cabin door. Tom stayed for supper and held Thomas for the better part of an hour while Thomas pulled his whiskers with great seriousness, and Tom made the faces of a man being magnificently tortured and pretending he found it perfectly pleasant. "He is a fine boy," Tom said when Lucy had taken Thomas for his evening feeding. "He looks like both of you somehow." "I think he looks like himself," Owen said. "That too," Tom said, and there was something in his voice that was plain and warm and honest. "You have done well, Owen, both of you. I am glad it worked out this way." "So am I," Owen said, which did not come close to covering it but was true. The summer of 1876 was everything the summer of 1874 had not been, which was to say it was full and warm and shared. The cattle were doing well, and the garden was flourishing, and Thomas was sitting up and looking at everything with the focused attention of a person who intended to learn all of it. And Owen and Lucy moved through their days together with the settled ease of two people who had found what they were looking for and recognized it and held on to it. There were still hard days, because the frontier did not stop being the frontier because you were happy, and the work of a cattle operation was constant and demanding, and things still went wrong with regularity. A heifer lost in a late spring storm. A fence section taken down by a fallen pine that took 2 days to clear and rebuild. A dry spell in July that made the creek run low and required hauling water from further upstream for 3 weeks. Owen handled each of these things the way he had always handled the difficulties of mountain life, directly and without drama, and Lucy was beside him for every one of them, and that was the difference. He had handled everything alone for 6 years, and it had been sufficient. He handled everything now with Lucy, and it was something else entirely, something that made him think the word sufficient did not belong in the same sentence as what his life had become. In the evenings when Thomas was asleep and the animals were settled and the work of the day was done, they sat by the fire or on the cabin steps depending on the weather, and Owen told her things he had never told anyone, thoughts he had kept so long they had gone quiet and now, spoken aloud to her in the firelight, turned out to have been waiting all this time to be said. She told him things in return, stories of her mother and her childhood and the life she had imagined and the life she had actually gotten, which she said with great honesty was in almost every way better than what she had imagined, even through the loss and the difficulty, because what she had imagined had been smaller than what was actually possible. "You did not imagine me," Owen said once, sitting on the cabin steps in the late summer dusk with Thomas asleep in the sling across his chest, the baby's warm, small weight anchored against him. "I did not know she said. "I did not know a person like you was something that existed. What kind of person is that?" She thought about it with her characteristic seriousness. "The kind who watches someone struggle for an entire summer and then walks over and helps," she said. "The kind who does the right thing without being asked. The kind who carries things quietly and never complains about the weight." She looked at him sideways in the fading light. "The kind who builds a cherry wood writing desk and says it was nothing." "It was not nothing," he admitted. "I know," she said. Thomas made a small sound in the sling and Owen put one large hand over his son's back, gentle and complete, and the baby settled again. "I kept thinking you would never come down off that ridge," Lucy said after a moment of comfortable quiet. "I kept seeing the smoke from your chimney in the mornings and thinking, there is a man up there who knows I am struggling and is watching me do it." "I knew you would manage," he said. "You are not forgiven for watching so long before coming," she said, but her voice was warm and entirely without heat. "The mountain lion expedited my timeline," he said. She laughed. "Yes, I should thank that lion." "I am not sure the lion would accept the gratitude." "No," she agreed. "I suppose not." She leaned her head against his shoulder, carefully so as not to disturb Thomas. "I am glad you came, Owen. I am glad you put down the field glasses and walked down the ridge." "I am glad you made coffee," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him. "That is your romantic statement. I am glad you made coffee." "It was very good coffee," he said. She shook her head and put her head back on his shoulder, and he wrapped his free arm around her, and they sat like that while the evening came in off the mountains, and the stars appeared one by one above the peaks, and the meadow grass whispered, and the mountains stood silent all around them, old and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small, warm brightness of 2 people and a sleeping baby on a cabin step. But the mountains were wrong about the indifference, Owen thought. Because if the mountains had been paying attention, they would have seen something worth noticing, something that was, in the larger account of things, rather fine. 2 years became 3, and 3 years moved toward 4, and the Mercer place on the mountain above Durango became the kind of homestead that people pointed to when they talked about what was possible out here if you worked hard and thought clearly and chose well. The herd grew to 22 head, and they hired on a young hand named Pete Larson in the spring of 1877, a 17-year-old from a struggling farm south of Durango, whose family Owen had known slightly, and who turned out to be both an excellent worker and entirely devoted to Thomas, whom he taught to whistle at the admirable, if inconvenient, age of 14 months. Lucy was expecting their second child by the summer of 1877, which she informed Owen one morning with the same matter-of-fact directness with which she informed him of everything important. And Owen lifted her and held her and was careful and was told not to be and was anyway. Their daughter arrived in February of 1878, small and dark-haired and fiercely alert from her first moments, and they named her Eleanor Rose Mercer. Eleanor for the simple reason that Lucy had always loved the name, and Rose for the small wild roses that grew along the creek below the south pasture, and that Owen had always privately considered one of the finest things about this particular piece of mountain earth. Thomas, who was 2 years and 4 months old, examined his sister with the expression of a small person, confronting something he had not entirely been prepared for, and then patted her very gently on the head, which Owen considered a satisfactory beginning. Eleanor Rose Mercer turned out to have her mother's directness and her father's stubbornness, and absolutely no patience for any situation she found unsatisfactory, which meant she was loud and determined and absolutely charming, and everyone who met her, including Tom Miller, who had entirely run out of restraint by this point, and simply adored both Mercer children with no dignity whatsoever, agreed that she was the finest person in Durango County. The spring of 1878 was clear and warm and early, and Owen was up on the ridge one morning in late April checking the old trapping lines he still kept for supplemental income, standing in the place where he used to stand and look down at the valley with his field glasses, and he stopped and looked down at the meadow below from long habit. He could see the Mercer place from here, the whole spread of it, the cabin with its solid repaired roof and the new barn and the extended pasture, and the orderly stack of firewood and the kitchen garden already showing its first green, and the small figure of Lucy moving between the house and the barn with Thomas trotting behind her, and Eleanor presumably inside with Pete, who had a gift for keeping her from destroying things while her mother was occupied. Owen stood on the ridge and looked down at what they had built together and felt something so full and so still that it took him a long moment to find the right word for it. Grateful was part of it. Proud was part of it. But the largest part of it was something that had no single word, the feeling of a man who has come all the way through loss and difficulty and solitude to stand in a place he did not know existed and find it is exactly where he belongs. He thought about that first summer, 1874, the smoke from the Callaway chimney, the figure in the sunbonnet chasing cattle across the meadow, the axe that was too big and the woman who swung it anyway. He had watched her struggle all that summer, first from his ridge and then from closer, and he had told himself it was not his place and she could manage and she did not need him, and all of those things had been true and also irrelevant, because the reason he had finally walked down off the ridge was not that she needed saving. She did not need saving. She had never needed saving. He had walked down because he needed to be near her. Because something in him had recognized something in her across the distance of a meadow and a summer's worth of careful watching, and had said, clear and certain as a bell in cold air, "That is where you are supposed to be." And he had been right. He turned and walked back down the ridge toward home, moving with the easy lope of a large man who knew this terrain the way he knew his own hands. And Lucy heard him coming and looked up from where she was by the barn and shaded her eyes against the morning sun, and even from a distance he could see the smile. Thomas saw him and came running across the meadow yard with the particular heedless speed of a 2-year-old who has no concept of their own fragility, arms out, shouting something that was probably Papa, though it sounded more like Baba still. And Owen caught him up mid-stride and swung him in a wide arc that produced a shriek of delight, and set him on his shoulders where Thomas grabbed fistfuls of Owen's dark hair and held on, which was his preferred method of riding. "Anything up on the ridge?" Lucy asked when he reached her. "Quiet," he said. "Season is good, lines are holding." She nodded and looked at his face the way she always looked at his face, reading it with the easy fluency of long practice. "You were standing up there looking down," she said. "I was," he admitted. "Thinking about the first summer," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because you get a particular expression," she said, "when you are thinking about it, something between sheepish and satisfied." "I was not sheepish," he said. "Owen," she said, with great patience, "you watched me fight a fence post for 45 minutes on a day in July when you were 20 yards away in the tree line." "I was not in the tree line." "You were absolutely in the tree line." He could not entirely argue with this because it was not entirely untrue. "I was giving you the chance to do it yourself," he said. "And you did eventually walk over," she said, with the tone of a woman who is willing to let things be approximately settled but reserves the right to remember all the details accurately. "I eventually walked over," he agreed. Thomas grabbed his hair again and said something emphatic, and Owen reached up and took his son's small hand in his large one and held it. And Lucy stepped close and put her hand on Owen's arm, and they stood there in the April morning on the land they had built together, with Alina Rose's voice carrying from inside the cabin in the clear and determined way that meant she was awake, and of the opinion that this condition should be more widely acknowledged. "She is awake," Lucy said, unnecessarily. "She has been awake for the past 5 minutes," Owen said, because the cabin walls were solid, but Alina had a voice that could carry through solid log with no difficulty. "I heard her on the ridge." Lucy laughed and turned back toward the cabin, and Owen followed with Thomas on his shoulders, ducking through the doorway with Thomas giggling as the frame ruffled his hair, into the warmth and the smell of the morning's bread and coffee, and Alina Rose Mercer, making known to all parties that the day had begun, and she would like someone to please acknowledge this fact. Pete Larson was doing his best with her in the main room, holding her up and making faces that she was finding insufficiently entertaining. And when he saw Owen, he held her out with the expression of a young man handing over something that technically belongs to someone else. Owen took his daughter in his arms, this small fierce person with her mother's dark eyes and her father's obstinate jaw, and she stopped shouting immediately and looked at him with an expression that was not exactly pleased but was willing to reevaluate. And then she grabbed his beard with both hands and pulled, which was her preferred greeting. "Good morning," he said, to Alina Rose. She said something decisive and unintelligible in return. "She thinks you were gone too long," Lucy said, from the stove where she was pouring coffee. "She thinks everyone is gone too long when they are not holding her," Owen said. "She has strong opinions about proximity," Lucy agreed, handing him the coffee and smiling at him over Alina's head. He took the coffee and stood there in the warm cabin with his daughter in his arms and his son sliding off his shoulders to go investigate something Pete was doing, and Lucy moving around the stove with the practiced ease of a woman entirely at home in her life. And outside, the April mountains were green and gold and enormous and beautiful, and Owen Mercer, who had been alone on a ridge for 6 years and had told himself that was sufficient, understood with his whole being the distance between sufficient and good. Good was this. Good was the woman who had come to the Calloway place with her axe and her stubbornness and her dream and her extraordinary quiet capacity for love. Good was the 2 children who were going to grow up in these mountains knowing that their parents had chosen each other honestly and held on. Good was the work of a life built together from the beginning by 2 people who had both come to it from loss and had found, in spite of that or perhaps because of it, that they understood what they had and intended to keep it. That evening, after Thomas and Alina were asleep and Pete had gone to his bunk in the barn, and the cabin was quiet, and the fire was low and warm. Owen and Lucy sat together on the bench by the window with the dark mountains visible beyond the glass and the stars thick above the peaks. Lucy had her head on his shoulder, and his arm was around her, and they had been quiet for a long time in the easy way of people who have no need to fill silence. "I am happy," Lucy said at last, not as a report but as a statement of something she wanted to say aloud because it was true and true things deserved to be said. "So am I," Owen said. She tilted her head to look up at him. "Do you miss it? The ridge? The solitude?" He thought about it genuinely, the way he thought about everything she asked him, because she deserved honest answers and not comfortable ones. "Not once," he said. "Not for a single morning." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I used to watch your smoke in the mornings up there. That whole first summer. I thought, there is someone up there, and I would not let myself need anyone, but some mornings I looked at that smoke and wanted very much to know who was there." "And now you know," he said. "Now I know," she said. "And it turns out you are exactly what I would have hoped for if I had let myself hope." She looked out at the mountains again. "Which is a remarkable thing to be able to say." Owen held her closer and looked out at the mountains with her, at the vast dark shape of the peaks against the star-thick sky, at the country that had given him 6 years of solitude, and then, when he had finally had the good sense to walk down a ridge, had given him everything else. The fire crackled low, and the mountain stood patient in the dark, and somewhere up on the ridge his old cabin kept watch over the valley. And in the cabin on the meadow Owen Mercer and Lucy Doyle Mercer sat together in the quiet and were entirely, completely, permanently home. Thomas grew up knowing every trail on that mountain and every animal on the ranch by name, and he had his mother's practical intelligence and his father's physical strength, and a way with cattle that people noticed when he was still young enough to be surprising. Alina Rose grew up being the loudest and most determined person in any room she entered, which was considerable, and she had the writing desk, which she claimed as her personal property at the age of 6, and used from that point forward with the focused seriousness of someone who had something to say and intended to say it. Owen built a second room onto the cabin in 1880 to account for the children getting older and needing space, and then a covered porch the following spring because Lucy had mentioned once that she would like a place to sit in the rain and listen to it on the roof. And Owen had built her one within the month, which Tom Miller heard about and reported throughout the county as evidence that Owen Mercer, who had once been the most self-contained man in the San Juan Mountains, had become thoroughly and completely soft, which Tom said with the affection of a man who considered this the finest possible development. Owen went into Durango once a month still, for supplies, and people knew him differently now than they had in 1874. He was still quiet and still formidable, still the man who could handle most things that the frontier threw at a person, but he smiled more easily, and he stopped to talk more readily, and there was something about him that had come open in a way that made people want to sit near him. The way you want to sit near a fire that is warm and steady and reliably itself. Lucy became, over the years, a kind of fixed point for the women of the outlying homesteads, the woman you went to when things were hard, because she had a reputation for both practical help and honest talk, and because she did not pretend things were easier than they were, but she also did not allow unnecessary despair, and that combination of realism and stubbornness turned out to be tremendously useful to people trying to build lives in difficult country. Owen watched her at this work with the same attention he had given everything about her from the first summer, and felt the same thing he always felt when he watched her, a deep and settled pride that was not about ownership but about recognition, the recognition of seeing someone's essential self fully expressed in what they did with their days, and finding it entirely and completely good. There was an evening in the summer of 1882, 8 years after that first summer of watching and walking over, When Owen and Lucy were sitting on the covered porch in the late evening rain that came off the mountains and smelled of pine and wet stone and clean, cold air. Thomas was 12 and Eleanor was 4.5, and both of them were inside, Thomas reading and Eleanor long since asleep after a day that had fully exhausted everyone, including herself. The rain was soft and steady on the porch roof, just as Lucy had wanted it when she had mentioned she would like to hear rain from a covered place. And Owen had his boots off and his feet stretched out, and Lucy was leaning against his side with her legs tucked under her, and the lantern inside the window throwing warm light across the wet porch boards. "Do you remember," Owen said, "the first time you came up to my cabin, for the goat?" "September 29th, 1874, Lucy said immediately. "I remember because I had been arguing with myself about it for a week. About coming up, about asking for help," she said. "I did not like asking for help." "You do not still like asking for help," he said. "That is broadly true," she allowed, "but I am better at it." "You are," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the rain. "I remember standing on your porch and thinking that your cabin was more orderly than I had expected, for a man living alone." "I am an orderly person," he said. "You are," she said. I was relieved. An orderly man is a man who thinks ahead, and I needed someone who thought ahead. A pause. "I did not know then that I needed you specifically. I just knew I needed the goat seen to." "And I have seen to the goat," he said. "You have seen to considerably more than the goat," she said, and turned her head to look up at him in the rain-soft evening, and her eyes were warm and dark and steady, and he looked at her and felt 8 years of everything they had been to each other, all the ordinary and extraordinary and difficult and wonderful days of it, and it settled on him with the weight and warmth of something absolutely real. He put his hand along her jaw and kissed her, easy and long, with the rain steady on the roof and the mountains dark and close around them and the light from the window warm against the evening, and she kissed him back with the same completeness she had always given to everything that mattered to her, which was this, him, their life, everything they had made together. When they broke apart, she looked at him and said, "Owen Mercer." "Lucy Mercer," he said. "I am very glad you walked down off that ridge," she said. "I am very glad you made good coffee," he said, because this was their oldest joke now, and it would never stop being entirely true. She laughed and leaned back against him, and the rain came soft and clean off the mountains, and the cabin behind them was warm and lit, and full of the quiet breathing of their children, and the life they had chosen and built. And Owen Mercer held his wife on the porch in the summer rain, and understood, as clearly as he had ever understood anything, that a man who has found what he was looking for and knows it, and keeps it, is about as well off as a person can reasonably expect to be. Outside, the San Juan Mountains rose in the dark, vast and ancient and without opinion, and the smoke from the Mercer chimney rose straight up into the wet summer air, steady and unhurried, the way a fire burns when it has everything it needs and intends to keep burning for a very long time.